Thank you. So first of all, I wish to thank the organizers, of course, all the participants, all of you who have come today, and everyone who's following us from the media. So I have been dealing forever with Zen, Japanese Buddhism, and this is what I would like to talk to you about today. I think that this occasion of this conference, Dharma Today, is indeed a fantastic opportunity to make the point of the problems of Dharma today and future perspective. So, the title, my title, is the Transmission of Zen in the West and its modern interpretations. And as a foreword, I would like to say that if we want to understand the role of Zen in contemporary Buddhism, we have to first think about how Zen has been introduced in the West, starting from the second half of the 20th century, how it has been understood, interpreted, and retransmitted, and how today is present in the minds of people and the practitioners. So in general, the image of Zen in the West, on the one hand, is a fruit of the transmissions of intellectuals who have spread the Zen doctrine in America and in Europe around the half of the last century, and then the Westerners who have interpreted it diversely and have retransmitted it in a form that were sometimes philosophical or in scientific context or with a popular outlook. So the way in which Buddhism can be developed in the Western society and have an active role in this context highly depends on the collective imagery that was created around its doctrine. This imagery, which is a product of the process of abstraction, of reformulation operated by our receptor, is the propulsive force that will determine its insertion in the Western society. So it is important to understand how this has been created and developed. We're going to see that the history of Zen in the West can be divided in some great phases or currents. The first being developed around the half of last century, the second most recently, and the third, which is actually undergoing currently. And I will talk about it in detail. All of them had a very important role within Western societies, even though in a different form, because it's quite hard to recognize a common origin for them called Zen in an abstract way. And they are intertwined and reciprocally influenced, and they are all the fruit of Western interpretation. Therefore, the imagery I mentioned before that had determining influences also on the vision of Zen in Japan itself. So this Western imagery or reformulation in the West had also consequences on the Zen that is practiced in Japan. Now, before going to a short description, I would like to state that recently some scholars, especially Anglo-Saxon scholars, developed a critical trend towards an abstract vision of Zen, which is very present today. These scholars are trying to reconsider the quote-unquote Zen phenomena on less theoretical basis by proposing some studies that have the objective of reconstructing the social and doctrinal history of this school, or even of these schools, by differentiating them and contextualizing them with a historical reconstructive approach. We hope that this attitude, which is now only in academic circles, can be extended to other domains, because I think that the objectivity of this study is very important for the birth of a new way of transmitting Zen into the West. So let's take a look at the first phase. First phase that was developed around the 20th century. Transmissions of Zen happened thanks to some masters who circulated Zen in the West: Suzuki, Samasu, Shinichi, Abe Masao, and others. The characteristic of this first wave, so to speak, is that they have deliberately wanted to evidence the abstract and philosophical aspects presented in a critic and apologetic way by providing an idealized image of Zen, which doesn't take into account its history, the evolution, and the actual praxis and the context of society, and the Japanese timings, of which we don't know very much at all. And I'm saying this because I have come to know Zen about that time, so I know really well how it was then. So we have a mythical vision of Zen, which is still very strong, and it's very difficult to spread this because it has a lot of contradiction. Albert Werther from the University of Arizona says that the apologetics of the Zen of 20th century, and I quote, have sold to the world the history of Zen as a transcendental spiritualism which is uncontaminated by institutional involvements. So there are traits that are next to mysticism. Others have criticized this type of approach by saying, and I quote, what has been introduced is a decontextualized form of Zen, non-institutionalized, simplified, and somehow idealized, which has also been deprived of its rigid rules and codes which governed and still govern life within monasteries. So the emphasis was on transmitting Buddhism not based on sources and on the notion of Mu, nothing, and emptiness, and the Zazen practice as a sitting meditation. End of quote. One of the main problems of this type of approach is to consider Zen as something special, which is distinguished by any form of spirituality and religion, which offers a spiritual religion. Satori is the enlightenment, which is unique and unrepeatable. Zen is conveyed from mind to mind, independently from written texts, as Bodhidharma taught us. So this makes Zen undefinable, undescribable, with rational tools and dialogic tools, positioning it into an absolute sphere. This unattaches Zen from its Buddhist origins, and particularly the Mahayana. So there is a lot of debate on whether Zen should be considered a philosophy or a religion. And most people go towards the first option, philosophy, by applying definitions that have been born and are deeply ingrained in Western culture, with a thought system and spiritual paths typical of the East, risking to distort the meaning. So this interpretation of Zen by Robert Sharf, a modern scholar, defines free-floating Zen. So a Zen that is devoid of any connections with other systems makes it easier to use in modern Western contexts, especially to socio-political ends. It is an ideological Zen, unattached from its roots, rules, history, and made abstract compared to the praxis of monasteries in Japan. In the West, especially in America of the 60s, it was interpreted as a doctrine with political, iconoclast, liberating, and permissive policies, which was liberating this from the restrictive links of conservative society, sometimes going all the way towards proclaiming going back to a spontaneous state and fusion. So freedom, pureness, autodetermination, self-determination, and respect for rules were attributed to the Zen current, especially by the West, by exalting the individual who is at the center of attention. This was an irrational and anti-conventional approach, and purely a subjective one, which was taking some ideas from the Mondo and Koan, which are illogical stories that became a symbol of disruption from convention. So Zen was becoming some kind of freedom discipline with a new vision of how to live in this world. This is Suzuki. The case of Suzuki is the most representative, and he is the one that produced the most important impact in the 20th century, like Carl Gustav Jung, Adolf Huxley, Erich Fromm, and so many other scholars of psychology were fascinated by his teaching, and they all elaborated on the doctrine of Zen of Suzuki. But starting from the 90s, Suzuki was much criticized by Chan and Zen scholars like John McRae, Dana Ford, Robert Sharf, and others. They were criticizing Suzuki's Zen because it was a method that was free of any links, which wasn't connected to the traditional ceremony. So it was abstract from its historic dimension. And Suzuki maintained that Zen is a spirit of every religion and philosophy. It is a mystical experience that is present in all religions. Suzuki's Zen is also the Zen Rinzai, which doesn't think about the Soto school or the Obako school. So his interpretation of Zen was certainly biased, as it privileges the practice of koan and immediate experience of enlightenment. So this is occasional readers that have understood Zen over the last decades, even though today there is a sort of tradition that prevails. The famous controversy, Suzuki was accused of ignoring history to decontextualize the historical context of Zen for an abstract version. According to his Zen is idealized and mystical, and more than one scholar has absolutely underlined the chauvinist theme in Suzuki's Zen. For example, he says Zen is the spirit of Buddhism, but it is truly the spirit of all religions and philosophies. When Zen is understood, you reach the absolute peace of mind, and man lives as it is supposed to live. End of quote. So it was a great and important idea to transmit in Europe Suzuki's Zen by forming a mythical vision of Japanese Zen. At the end of the 50s and in the 60s, there was a great success, even thanks to the work of thinkers like Alan Watts, who was active especially on the west coast of the United States and published many different books that have become bestsellers on Zen. Attracted by Eastern thinking and Suzuki, he dedicated himself to divulgating the Zen doctrine in many works that had great success. Then there is another quote by Watts, which the interpreters don't have, by the way. And I quote, "We must not forget the social context of Zen, which is mainly a way of liberation for those who have overcome the norms of social convention, an individual by the group. Zen is a medicine for the sinister effects of this conditioning, etc., etc." These are expressions that were recurring during the 60s and also afterwards in Europe. So, if you remember the Beat generation of the 50s and 60s, of which Watt was an exponent, you would understand that the Zen, from that angle, had a lot of success, especially the role of spiritual foundation of the generation who wanted to protest, look for freedom, and looking for self-determination. So the search for a new spirituality, refusal of consumerism, a renewed relation with nature, wanting freedom, refusing rules, researching for a new humanism, attraction towards mysticism, the charm of irrational thought were amongst the main ingredients that got young generations of American close to an imagined Zen, with the help of translations of Zen masters who were mainly Chinese. Because if you read Watts' texts, he speaks about Zen, but in a way, he is quoting Chinese koans, which impressed because of the with the attitude of freedom and mysticism. So this is a vision of Zen which is completely outside the Japanese tradition, but it's still very interesting because it has a very original approach. And this also recalls the trends of Taoism, its spontaneousness and refusal of conventions. So from this movement, what developed was an important literary current, which includes novelists and poets like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Gregory Corso, Neil Cassidy, Gary Snyder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Norman Mailer, etc., etc. Now, to understand the spirit that was animating Zen, you should just read the Dharma poems, which inspires to the doctrine of Chao Zhang, talking about spiritual and the material path of the author, who says, I was convinced to be a bhikkhu in modern clothes, trying to go and turn the wheel of Dharma and obtain merit as a future Buddha, or a world of nomads, vagabonds of Dharma, refusing to adhere to general requests and are forced to work to obtain the privilege to consume. All the Zen crazy people that go around writing poems that come up in their mind with no reason in the world. End of quote. So Dharma vagabonds are Zen crazy people. Why? Because for them, Zen or Chanzen is crazy and is identified with the nonsense dialogues of Chinese masters that are taken as a model. And just like them, they have some small and large moments of enlightenment, but then suddenly under the tree at night, I had an idea. Everything is empty but awake. Things are empty in time, in space, and in mind. Or other quotes, I was forgetting the path of Buddhism. I wanted to be happy. I was looking at the new birds, at the dogs yawning. I was swallowing Dharma. I was looking at grass. I was looking at chickens, and I was practicing dhyana under a cloudy moon. This is the world as it is. End of quote by Kerouac. So all the student movements of the 60s, of the 1960s in Europe, were deeply influenced by some principles of the Beat generation. And in the university context, it had taken the structure of an organized form going towards political and social activism. So we could say that transmission of Zen by the Japanese masters of last century had some repercussions, including many sectors of the Western society, and contributed to modify it. So, after the first phase, we're going to get to the second phase. Recently, we have been observing a new phase. The movement called Engaged Buddhism developed, which proposes a higher involvement, an active involvement in the problem of modern society. In the definition by Sally King, and I quote, engaged Buddhism is a contemporary form of Buddhism which is actively committed, but in a non-violent way, in social, economic, political, and ecological problems of society. In its most elevated form, this commitment is not separated by Buddhist spirituality. It's not separated, pay attention to that, but it's certainly an expression of this. End of quote. So as up to now, Buddhism has been seen as a way of individual liberation. According to some, this is no longer enough because dealing with self or non-self doesn't take into account one of the fundamental vows of the Bodhisattva, which is helping all sentient beings to attain enlightenment. The altruistic action is the highest form of attaining the virtue of compassion because it's not selfish or self-centered, and so it enacts the fundamental principle to recognize the lack of substance of the I. So dealing with self or dealing only with self is going against the fundamental teachings of Buddhism, Mahayana, of course. Even though we're talking about going through a path of self-perfectioning. So to say it like Foucault, the care of self is progress compared to the trend of not taking care of one's own spirituality.
So si ferma a metà strada e per giungere sulla vetta deve disfarsi della preoccupazione di sé. L'azione sociale, cioè volta al bene altrui, è un'azione pura, poiché priva di connotazioni egoistiche. È l'azione del Bodhisattva, che dopo essere giunto al proprio perfezionamento si occupa interamente degli altri. Il perfezionamento proprio, pur necessario, non è quindi la meta finale, ma solo un primo stadio che permette quello successivo volto all'esterno. Per questo, nel Mahayana si considera incompleto il percorso dell'Arat, che si occupa esclusivamente di sé. Il buddismo impegnato generalmente non pone il raggiungimento della saggezza come stadio preliminare indispensabile per dedicarsi in seguito all'altro da sé. Per esempio, come insegnato nei 10 stadi del Bue, come è già stato citato, dove dopo aver raggiunta l'illuminazione, il giovane che ha ripreso il bue che era scappato, torna nella società e va nel posto più, come dire, più mondano che allora esisteva, cioè il mercato. No? Ma vede.
But then there is also an engagement to exert compassion and detachment from self, abandoning egoism, and a practice of enacting the moral doctrine taught by the Buddha. In this way, we are trying to reconcile meditative practices and individual practices that are typical of Buddhism with a social action by maintaining that both of them lead to spiritual growth. And stressing the ethical side is considered also a virtuous behavior, which leads to liberation of self, attachments, and perversions. Another stress is placed onto nature, so the ecologic ethics and the necessity of an harmonious relationship between man and its environment. And so the model is a YN or Kegon school, or the Indra net, as you see in this image, namely the harmonious interrelation of all the elements of reality. It would be nice to deepen this subject, but we don't have any time. So in the Buddhist declaration in Assisi in 1986, the vocation of Buddhism is declared formally as to the preservation of the natural environment with regard to our survival and the undeniable right of the inhabitants of these planets and species to have right for survival. So basically what is said here is that Buddhism must deal with the environment, with survival of human species, etc. So the action towards other people's benefit is certainly the most compassionate action of bodhisattvas. Compassion and wisdom are the two key virtues of Mahayana. This is important, and the practice of both of them conducts to liberation. But wisdom with no compassion means pursuing personal perfecting, whereas compassion with no wisdom corresponds to acting beneficially, but this produces attachment. So both are partial and take away from the real target. Only together they can bear fruit. So there must be compassionate action in wisdom and searching for wisdom through compassion. It is clear, however, that social action by itself is not enough to be considered spiritually educational if it's not characterized by certain factors. Between these factors, we have to mention the topic of detachment. If social action involves involvement, attachment, and produces passions and cravings, negative karma is created, and it is no longer a pure Buddhist action. So the topic of detachment is very delicate for those who interpret Buddhism and Zen in a social key, because in these cases, involvement has many more possibilities of manifesting itself and conducing away from Buddhist teachings. On the other hand, detachment as a retreat from society, even though it's less exposed to these dangers, could remain in the scope of an action that is concentrated on the self. So the topic and practice of detachment go on a very thin road and could be misinterpreted in the modern world, where we always talk about participating rather than detachment, social action under form of interventions for social, environmental, and humanitarian problems. Still, it's important for practitioners to talk about these critical topics, to evaluate the risks that are thought in Buddhism. Thich Nhat Hanh has been one of the main exponents of this type of Zen school. He has recently passed away. He's been an activist for peace during the War of Vietnam and continued his activity in Europe. Since 1974, he founded the Order of Interbeing. The Order of Interbeing, which aimed at creating an engaged Buddhism that puts meditation together with the awareness of every moment and concrete and compassionate action in society. In a text called The Art of Letting Go, 2016, Thich Nhat Hanh describes four ways of detachment that are incarnated in the four Brahmadhyara, the attitude to cultivate love, maitri metta, compassion karuna, joy udita, and equanimity upeksha. These are the characteristics of the enlightened person and have to be practiced with no personal involvement. For Thich Nhat Hanh, love is fundamental. Love towards the others is fundamental. It's written in all of his books. However, the term, the Sanskrit and Pali term maitri metta is benevolence, but he translated as love, which for us has different connotation. In the field of spirituality is also taking us back to Christianism. So I'm going to skip on a quote because time is going fast.
In definitiva, come dice lo studioso.
So, as Sharp says, engaged Buddhism is considered modern, cosmopolitan, humanistic and socially responsible. It is some kind of real Buddhism. So a Buddhism that has no superfluous information. So it is some kind of universal religion that can be superimposed to other religions. Its nature is to be rational, empirical, and responsible, but in agreement with modern science. It is also very actual because it can it can give solutions to problems that are afflicting modern society. So it seems like today Buddhism is seen as a religion that has positive answers for the problems of the modern world and that can provide spiritual and intellectual tools that are that is easy to face. This interpretation of Buddhism and Zen was born as a modern interpretation of ancient doctrines, and we don't find it in ancient texts, even though there are no characteristics that are comparable to modern characteristics. It's also important to notice that engaged Buddhism is very popular in the West, but also in traditional Buddhist schools in Asia. So this is a modern interpretation of an extension of Buddhist doctrines, particularly those that are founded on ethics and compassion towards all sentient beings present in Mahayana. And thanks to the engaged Buddhism, Buddhism is finding a new way, a new role in the modern world by proposing a social function in a moment when Buddhism is or was going through a crisis and decline phase. And I'm still talking about Japan because I know the Japan better. So many schools reacted in this way. So engaged Buddhism can be seen as one of the adaptive evolutions that over the centuries have been one after the other, and enlightened Buddhism has spread over different countries, and probably when coming to the West, this Buddhism will play an important role in our Western society. Our society is asking strong social commitment from religion. And from this point of view, I am very hopeful. Now, a third phase. I haven't got much time left. The third phase, I'm going to try to shorten my presentation and get to my conclusion. Thich Nhat Hanh was also the promoter, starting from the 70s, of a practice that now is becoming very popular, not only in Buddhist areas, but everywhere. Mindfulness, which is namely awareness or mental presence. So what is Thich Nhat Hanh proposing? He's proposing mindfulness with the idea of applying an ancient meditative practice that goes back to the historical Buddha or even before, to the challenges of the modern times. He published a really interesting book in '66 called The Miracle of Mindfulness, and so on and so forth. In Buddhism, attention to the awareness of the present moment, that is called sati or smriti in Sanskrit, is part of the techniques of the Eightfold Path that takes to liberation. Samyasati, which is the right awareness described in Satipatthana Sutta, has been practiced in Asia also under the forms of Vipassana meditation. The Eightfold Path talks about right mental presence, but also right concentration, etc. In his text, Thich Nhat Hanh translates the term sati with mindfulness, which is an English neologism which is not very transparent and that could create some ambiguities. However, it's important to remember that sati, and here some scholars of ancient Buddhism can say something about it, means awareness, conscious attention, and is one of the 7 factors of enlightenment. So there is a debate amongst scholars on the meaning of sati and its translation in Western languages, but we cannot talk about it now. Probably the original meaning in the Buddhist context is awareness of the relevant value of phenomena. So being aware of impermanence, of the empty nature of phenomena. I think, though, that mindfulness doesn't really give this idea, the word mindfulness. Sorry, I'm going to have to skip some parts. Today, the practices of mindfulness have been effective in facing some psychological problems like anxiety, depression, etc. And now, this is obviously what mindfulness is used for, and it obscures the religious and Buddhist aspects by privileging aspects that are relevant to well-being and therapeutical. So in this case, practicing mindfulness means going away from religious topics, and it is proposed as a technique to support well-being, psychological and physical well-being, or to increase concentration and improve performance. So this downgrade of meditation, in a generic sense, from a practice that is going towards having wisdom to a technique with utilitarian ends, is not so negative or worrying if it wasn't put into relation with Buddhism. Basically, it's talking about the fact that Buddhism, as the end of creating well-being, interpreting the third noble truth of cessation of suffering as the search for well-being without including a path towards wisdom, prajna. And meditation, by the way, in every form, shouldn't be connected to the Zen school, even though it represents a fundamental practice, because different forms of meditation are present in all of the Buddhist schools, and also in fields such as yoga that are non-Buddhists. And the practice also dates back before Buddhist teaching. So it is not correct to propose a Zen practice as you hear today, because mindfulness and Zazen are 2 completely different things. Discriminating between meditative practice and mindfulness is the difference between practice on the one hand and technique on the other. These are 2 different things, and we have to be very careful not to confuse them. Practice is an action or a behavior that wants to manifest the nature of Buddha in every individual, whereas technique is a tool to acquire whatever. The difference is that practice, at least in Zen, is not an acquisition tool, not even of enlightenment or physical well-being. So I welcome mindfulness. It's fantastic. It's a very good thing. But we have to keep it separate from Buddhism, especially from Zen, that do not have to be degraded to techniques aiming at well-being. Conclusions. Sorry, I forgot my slides again. We noticed. I did write my numbers down, but okay. So conclusions. I will be very brief. It it is necessary today to make an effort to see Buddhism and Zen for what they are: liberation paths from the painful cycle of birth and death. So by pain as the existential malaise, which is intrinsic to human existence, not as a specific suffering, but caused by search of happiness in what is transitory, moved by our craving and illusion, stopping to follow things of the world, to believe that they are stable, permanent, and they merit appropriation. It is extinguishing the thirst of craving and getting to quiet and joy of equanimity. This is only possible if we stop having this self that feeds into this thirst. So Buddhism can help us in this without abandoning the world, living inside the world and committing to be beneficial to all sentient beings, because detachment is not aimed at the world, but at mundanity as a model of life that is centered around egoism, carelessness, and bringing into the chaos of the world one's own inner peace, balance, and detachment. So this is what is said in Christianity: to be in the world, but not to be of the world. And the famous text, Zen text, the 10 stages of the ox, says the same thing. The ox goes back to the world because the dust of the world is no longer attached. The dust is there, and the liberated goes to the world without getting dirty, like the cloud without the, like the moon without the clouds. To develop the capacity of being immersed in the world and yet a stranger to the logics that dominate the world. So the message that Buddhism conveys and Zen conveys is very powerful, especially if we understand it correctly. Great actuality today in the world where we're living. And it's not so much to obtain more well-being or happiness, but it is the highest aim of opening our eyes on the delusions of the reality that create dukkha, the malaise, protecting us from the hypertrophy of our egoism and making us blind. Buddhism can help us recover our equanimity and lost humanity and make us become beings that cross the world in an aware way. And that's why we have to insert this into the Western society. But we have to keep in mind that the abstract mythical visions of the past, just like the reductionist views of a Dharma, are not appropriate but deceiving. I would end with a quote of the great Zen master Dogen, which sums up what I was trying to say. If now you think to practice the way of the Buddha and the patriarchs, do not expect anything, do not look for anything, do not think you're going to obtain anything. Practice the way of the saints of the past without thinking about your gain, and behave like patriarchs. Detach yourselves from any search. You don't even have to aspire to Buddhahood, but if you stop practicing and dwelling on bad behavior, you will fall into the research of something, and you'll never get out from this hole without any aspirations, only by hoping to become a person that brings joy to mankind and heavenly beings, by maintaining the behavior of the monk, to act for the salvation of sentient beings, practicing any type of good and throwing away the bad that has been done so far, never being happy with the good that you've done so far, and continuing to do this for the whole life. This is what the ancient were talking being able to get to enlightenment. So the behavior of the patriarch Buddhas is this. Thank you so much. I have finished.